Can superpowers reconcile? With so much at stake in the U.S.-China relationship, an in-person meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi counts more than ever. From curbing chemicals used in fentanyl to reestablishing crucial military communication, is the U.S.-China relationship finally improving post-Trump? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. Chinese President Xi Jinping has described the U.S.-China relationship as the most important in the world. Washington and Beijing have two of the planet's most powerful militaries, as well as a number of conflicting strategic interests. When it comes to the global economy, it's been said China is the engine while the U.S. provides the fuel. So it came as a relief to many to see leaders of the two nations meet in person last week for the first time in years. And most hailed their meeting as a success. But how much did they actually achieve? Is it a genuine step forward or just a pause in deterioration? Well, that debate in just a minute, but first, a closer look at the Xi-Biden summit.
The summit between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping is touted as a milestone in U.S.-China relations. Dialogue between the two countries reached a new low after the U.S. shut down a Chinese spy balloon not far off the South Carolina coastline in February. In response, the United States imposed severe export controls on technologies vital for developing military tools. The point of the recent gathering in San Francisco was to bring U.S. and China back to a normal course of corresponding and being able to talk to one another without intermediaries, according to Biden.
I value our conversation because I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader, with no misconceptions or miscommunication. We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict, and we also have to manage it responsibly.
Despite being cautious, China seems to be warm to the idea.
The China-US relationship has never been a smooth sailing in the past 50 years and more, as it always bumps into this or that problem. But it nevertheless has been kept moving forward in twists and turns. For such two large countries like China and the United States, turning their back on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other. And conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides. The planet Earth is big enough for two countries to succeed.
Both parties involved agreed to re-establish military communication. The US had been pushing for it for a while, and now that China is on the same page, that should mean no more unsafe interaction between either country in the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan situation was one China asked the United States to leave alone at the summit. The US had been quietly helping Taiwan strengthen its defense, and reportedly is putting aside a nearly $20 billion fund to possibly be used against China. And that partly has something to do with Washington-based intel that suggests Beijing might be planning a Taiwan invasion by 2027, although Xi denied that claim. Late Chinese Premier Li Keqiang might have had peaceful, strong relations with Taiwan in mind. But first he was removed from his post, then passed away. And now, China is more pressing about how Taiwan and itself belong together, but Taiwan might beg to differ. The military collaboration decision from the Biden-Xi summit may be a positive sign for the coming year, but in the long run, some argue one meeting won't be enough for long-term collaboration. And as Taiwan openly said it is cooperating with the US on national defense issues, along with Biden calling Xi a dictator, relations between two remain ambiguous.
So the relationship may be ambiguous, but is it much better than the lows reached during the Trump administration? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Ann Arbor, Michigan, Jeffrey Stacey. He's a former U.S. State Department official in the Obama administration. From Beijing, we have Qinduo, a fellow at the Pangoal Institute and former China Radio International chief correspondent. And from London, Duncan Bartlett, a research associate at the SOAS China Institute. Thanks all so much for being with me. Jeff, Stacey, let me ask you if you would describe this meeting as a reset. You know, former President Trump was quite antagonistic, to say the least, toward China. Biden hasn't necessarily repaired that damage, but they're talking now. And both were clear on wanting to maintain a relationship and open communication. So is the world better off, or are there still too many kind of unpredictable factors here?
It is better off, and that's a good thing. I mean, the first deliverable was really they're getting together at all after these historic lows subsequent to the balloon spy incident. And you really had a Xi Jinping that was coming into this summit much weaker than an American president is accustomed to meeting his counterparts. But there was no guarantee at all that things would go well, and they did. As a result, the chief, I guess you would say, deliverable is that the waters of the geopolitical world are calmer as a result of this meeting in San Francisco. Everything from military to military contacts being back, the so-called hotline between the presidents is back. We've got commitments on, I guess, reducing the precursor drugs to the fentanyl drug that is so devastating that are made by the Mexican cartels from Chinese imports. Even a panda agreement to keep sharing pandas, and some work on climate together. So it really did as much as at least the American side was hoping in terms of hopefully rock solid commitments. But the devil, as always, is in the details.
Indeed. Yeah, the media really loves the panda angle there. But let me ask you, Qinduo, I mean, are the waters calmer? Would you say the same, even in the South China Sea, for example?
I would say so. And Avia, you mentioned, they say the world will feel is better off. I think that's a very good point. I think both leaders, they sensed this responsibility on their shoulders, that their relationship is not only about the two countries, it is about the peace and stability throughout the world. I mean, China-U.S. ties, they are the anchor of the international, security of the international arena. So if they don't have a good relationship, we can see there will be a lot of problems, many more problems than we have now. And so it's good to see that they are talking to each other, and we do see there are deliverables. Yes, they are, let's say they are just touching the surface probably, people-to-people exchange. It's really about implementation. For example, Chinese invitation to 50,000 young Americans to visit China, either through study program or other programs in the next 5 years. That's promising. It's really about the implementation, the cooperation from both sides.
Looks like we've lost Zhu's connection. We'll get back to him as soon as we can reestablish that. But let me turn to Duncan. I mean, I saw you agree, at least nod your head in agreement with what I think was saying that the world is better off, that this meeting was successful. But some are complaining that the elephant in the room was ignored here, and that is Taiwan. Do you think that there was a deliberate avoidance of something that really will determine what this relationship does in the future? I mean, Xi has said China won't make any sudden moves, but then others are saying the U.S. doesn't quite believe that.
Well, I'm quite sure that Taiwan was discussed between President Biden and Mr. Xi during their 4 hours of talks. Actually, Mr. Xi gave slightly mixed messages about Taiwan when he was speaking publicly during that meeting in California. He told Mr. Biden that reunification between China and Taiwan was unstoppable, and he used, I think, that word, reunification. But later on, when Mr. Xi was talking to the business leaders, he said something slightly different. He said, China does not seek spheres of influence and will not fight a Cold War or a hot war with anyone. And he was said to be exasperated at these claims by some apparent experts in the United States that China might be ready for an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Mr. Xi said clearly to Mr. Biden, That's simply not the case.
You know, I think if you can, because this is what confuses so many people, and saying that maybe the U.S. is trying to have it both ways by supporting Taiwan as, in a sense, an independent nation, but then telling China that they believe in the one China policy. What does that mean for the United States? Can they have it both ways? And is China happy to leave it at that?
Well, the United States doesn't actually officially recognize Taiwan as an independent nation because it does follow that one China policy, but it's certainly true that it has good relations with Taiwan, and in fact President Biden has authorized $80 million of expenditure for Taiwan to buy weapons to protect itself. What America wants to avoid is any sort of conflict and instability in East Asia. And so what Mr. Biden carefully avoided doing at his own press conference was to say that America was going to jump to the defensive of Taiwan if China attacks. But behind the scenes, of course, he's waving a big stick and saying, this is one of our red lines. If you want the business investment and the good diplomatic relationship with America, you must leave Taiwan alone.
Okay. Jeffrey, I mean, is that good enough? And can that status quo then be maintained?
Well, it's not quite good enough in the sense that the proof that's in the pudding is whether or not China starts to behave differently in the South China Sea. And we can see that immediately in terms of its relations with the Philippines, where it's been quite hostile lately. You see this extension of the Chinese Navy and these ghost fishing boat fleets that have been harassing quite seriously, including boat rammings and even a sinking at one point. You know, these kind of things, and the flybys in the air and at sea where fighter jets and destroyers come very close in proximity to one another. There was also a commitment on this, I understand, but this is where the skepticism is quite high on the American side, and we'll soon get rapid results. But what will really determine this is the Chinese assessment of the Western response to the war in Ukraine. That's what has really, we think, gotten this off the immediate agenda of China, looking at the dramatic extent to which almost the whole of the world, separate just a handful of authoritarian states, have come to the side of Ukraine. And that's what has caused China to make a reassessment, as well as the fact that Beijing is really holding a weaker hand these days, which would be interesting to get into in the discussion. So for these deep strategic reasons, we do believe that that exasperation that the Chinese premier demonstrated might actually be real this time.
Well, let's get into that then. Zhu, I mean, is China holding a weaker hand? And do you think Ukraine actually does hold some serious weight in determining where things stand?
I disagree with the American colleague. First of all, you know, it's a Chinese president, it's not a Chinese premier. They have different roles in dealing with the foreign relationship. And if you talk about the Ukraine, the case, I think the popular belief, that's true. The belief is like, you know, the West is losing in Ukraine. If there's any lesson, you would say Xi Jinping was encouraged by the loss or the failure of the West in Ukraine instead of showing a weaker hand while meeting Biden. So I disagree with that. And also, you know, even I believe, you know, when people talk about that thing, you know, Xi Jinping is in a weaker position, they're talking about the Chinese economy. I think that's a complicated topic, you know, Chinese economy. Yes, it was not growing in double-digit speed as in previous years, but 5%, more than 5%, is, I think, faster than many of the major economies around the world. I'm not sure that's how weak China is right now.
Okay. Let me get Duncan's take on what you've just heard. Go ahead.
Well, it's true that China's economy is still growing at about 5% according to the official figures, but I mean, that's a lot less than the double-digit growth it saw before. I mean, I think the other takeaway from this meeting is all the business-to-business connections You know, the head of Apple, Tim Cook, went to California to meet President Xi. Elon Musk of Tesla was there. And just a week before that, China was hosting a whole load of business representatives, including the president of Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong, saying China is a safe place to do business. Now, I'm reading between the lines here, but I don't think that the CIA would allow these titans of American industry to have this interaction with China's president and indeed a visit to Hong Kong if they thought that somehow there was going to be a military conflict in the region in the next couple of years. I think the signal coming from America is that it's safe to do business with China at the moment, but be cautious.
Okay, that's, I guess, encouraging. I mean, Jeffrey, are you on the same page there? And then also, I want to go back to the military issues here because one of the biggest deliverables, as you acknowledged, was the military-to-military contacts being reestablished in this presidential hotline to avoid misunderstandings and potential mistakes. Is it more than, symbolic, I guess? And should it give the business people that do so much important work with China to keep these two massive economies at their height? I mean, does it give them confidence to see that communication reestablished?
It does indeed, and let's be hopeful for a change. But part of that hope is, in fact, the weakness on the Chinese side. It's not true that the West is losing the war in Ukraine. It's not actually fighting the war in Ukraine. It is aiding the Ukrainians, who are beating the Russians, in fact, on the battlefield as we speak. But let's get back to the Chinese Indo-Pacific theater. And this is where the responsibility of China to essentially back off and cool things with regard to the Philippines, Vietnam, but Taiwan in particular. And we'll be waiting and watching to see if this takes place. But you've got to remember what's been going on in Beijing and in and around the major cities of China in recent months. You've had basically a collapse of the real estate market. You've had protests because of the severe COVID lockdowns when there was no Chinese vaccine. And so the only thing that the Chinese president could do was lock down the entire country at great cost, not just to the economy, but to society. And so there's no schadenfreude here. China's a great country. It's a great culture, great people. And it makes a great contribution overall to the world. But the stability that has been lacking because of a variety of Chinese pressures, that is what we need to see reduced. But
Jeffrey, so many nations have been struggling in similar ways, not least the United States. The U.S. economy, with the inflation, we've seen, if you're going to go back as far as the pandemic, that's when the U.S. was, witnessing even the January 6th events, insurrection, whatever you want to call it. There was just as much instability, one could really argue, in the U.S. as for China. So does it really put China at a disadvantage here?
Well, it does in the sense that the Biden administration is rock solid in terms of its internal stability. What we've seen in Beijing are disappearance of major figures who lead the Defense Department, who lead the Chinese version of the State Department, the Foreign Ministry, and other officials. So we know of, in fact, a great deal of turmoil inside the regime, and that is what matters a great deal. It is true that the U.S. has to overcome some serious challenges, as has the UK with its version of populism, but we're seeing a waning of populism around the world, not an increase. There are only just a few countries that support, shenanigans of seismic geopolitical proportions like the war in Ukraine. I'm afraid China is one of them, but at least it has moderated its contributions to that, and we hope to see that continue.
Interesting points. Qinduo, would you like to respond?
If you say that China is in a weak position, let's just point one fact. That is, the U.S. is dealing with both the Ukraine crisis and now the Gaza crisis. And the U.S. is offending the entire Muslim world and the Arab world. And we know even today there's a strong delegation for foreign ministers from some Arab countries and Muslim countries. They are in Beijing to seek the Chinese support to solve this problem. I think the fact itself is a win for Beijing. Is a signature that it is a sign that they are so disappointed with Washington that the West, by siding with Israelis, by basically supporting the genocide in Gaza, and they are losing support. They are losing popular support not only in the Arab Street but also in Arab capitals. So which leader is in a weak position? I don't think Biden can handle another crisis over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. So let's stop there about the debating which country is weaker. I mean, the U.S., they are going to have Trump again. So that's how powerful the U.S. is. So I don't think that's helpful in debating which country is more powerful. It's really about whether these two countries can coexist peacefully and whether they are going to have a war or military conflict. That's a consequential issue, not only for the two countries, but also for countries and regions in Asia and in the entire world. That's what matters. And I think for this discussion, as long as and many other discussions about China-U.S. relationship here.
Remains to be seen what happens in 2024. But I mean, Duncan, on that, it's a bit upsetting because there's this feelings among some on whatever progress might be made under Biden right now with the China-U.S. relationship. If in a year from now there's a different president in the United States, the whole thing could technically, be derailed. And for all the success that people saw in this meeting, a lot of people seem to think that it was, in a sense, brought back down at the very end when President Biden said that President Xi was actually still, he believed he's a dictator. So, I mean, even if there is success, how long do you think this can be sustained? And what are the real, the weakest links, I should say, in the chain that could pull it apart?
Well, let me take two of those points. First of all, I actually see more continuity in terms of U.S. foreign policy between the Trump and the Biden administrations over the situation with China and in the East Asian region than you might realize, actually. For example, America has worked very hard to get a rapprochement between South Korea and Japan. And both during the Trump administration and the Biden administration, we saw a big effort on the State Department on that side, which is now, Wang Yi, also the Chinese foreign minister, will be meeting the foreign ministers of Japan and South Korea at the weekend. Your other question was what would happen if there's if Trump wins the next election. It's very difficult to know because there isn't really very much open debate about what the foreign policy is on the Republican candidates, and I think that is a concern. You said that Mr. Biden called Xi Jinping a dictator. I mean, he was answering a loaded question from a reporter. He fell into a trap, basically. I think that is the other worry, that he's getting old and perhaps isn't able to clarify his thoughts and ideas as best as he could when he's under pressure.
Qinduo, we only have a minute left, so I needed to ask you about that. How did that play out in China? Was it actually covered by the Chinese press? Because the U.S. really, it was a headline, let's put it that way. How was it in the U.S.? And
yeah,
go ahead. China.
Let me tell you that the Chinese analysts of Chinese media, initial response is like, oh, that's a headache, That's not really the substantial topic between China and the U.S., right? Yes, we have different systems, we have different practice. It's really about whether we can coexist peacefully. And the reporter asked the question, that gesture itself, of course, people would say that's a trap for Biden, and Biden facing domestic pressure probably. He appears, he wants to appear tough on China, and people say he has no other answers. But I think the Chinese thought just let it go. Well, it's really about how the U.S. behave instead of how they say things about China or about Xi Jinping here.
Okay.
But there will be no President Trump. He'll be in a jail cell. We can be assured of that. So the rule of law domestically reigns as it should internationally, and that's the test going forward with American-Chinese relations. At least we know they're in calmer waters for now.
We have to hope so. Jeffrey, Stacey, I've just been given an extra minute, so I just need to ask you this because it has, I mentioned it, of course, in my intro, but for a foreign audience, there's a bit of a lack of understanding on why it was so important to reach that fentanyl deal. If you can quickly summarize why that matters so much to the United States and to its kind of local communities, that China has agreed to crack down on the producers and exports of those compounds that go into the creation of this drug.
It's quite important. It's a test of this relationship because of the deadly degree to which this has cut a swath through not just our country, but a whole host of others. And there have been commitments on this before. There's really not that much continuity between these administrations because that promise was made to the Trump administration and was not implemented. It did not result in a lessening. So we'd like to see a reduction of cyber attacks and cyber theft. We'd like to see calmer waters, for example, with the Philippines and its Navy. And so these are going to be the tests going forward, but there is a better chance that basically China wants a secure, stable, local theater and larger theater, and that's a good thing going forward.
Okay, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Great to have you all, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.